Tonight we are looking at 3 horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. A diver swims past the one beam of sunlight that knows the way out of the shaft, a flooded stadium under a sheep paddock. An Atlantic swell arrives 2 hours early at Fingal's cave, with 2 photographers 60 meters inside the instrument. And a flood pulse sweeps a surveyor 800 meters through the dark of Son Doong, the largest cave passage on Earth. Each story starts with confidence and ends in chaos. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On February 14, 2026, Lachlan Brodie lowered his tanks through a hole in a hot sheep paddock in South Australia, into the shaft, the only cave that opens through a manhole in a farm field, a lid of grass hiding a flooded chamber the size of a stadium. He and his mate Mick had permits, 200 bar each, and one plan. Drop the entry shaft, tour the daylight zone at 30 meters, and be out within 40 minutes before the paddock got properly hot. Lachlan was 29 years old, a cave diver who had logged 200 dives in the sinkhole country of Mount Gambier, fit, quick, and famous in his club for exactly the wrong thing: a talent for one more look. His logbook margins were full of it, in his own handwriting. Went a bit further. Worth it. The brief that morning was Mick's, and it had one law in it: stay where you can see the beam. Here is what you need to understand about the shaft. The manhole is the only window, and the chamber below it is vast and black. The sun drops through that small opening as a single beam, a pencil of light standing in the middle of a flooded stadium. The pencil is not scenery. It is the exit sign, the compass, and the clock, all in one. And it is the only one the room has ever had. The drop was glorious, the way it always is. Through the manhole, through the neck, and out into open black water with the beam blazing beside them like a green-gold column. They fell along it to 30 meters and hung there, 2 small men in a room that swallowed their torches whole, the silence broken only by the click and hiss of 2 regulators. Below them, the chamber sloped away into the dark, 120 meters deep at the far end, and the slope was paved with boulders the size of cars. At the edge of the beam, that is where the room began to whisper, a pale shape far down the slope, maybe stone, maybe old gear, sitting just past where the light gave up, because a chamber this size does not end, it only fades, and the one law brief had already failed. Lachlan drifted 3 fin kicks toward it, then 5, his torch making its little coin of light on the boulders. What he didn't know, easing down the slope with his eyes on the shape. At 40 meters on air, the narrow margin thins fast. And that habit would now write its last margin note. One more look. In a room where every direction away from the pencil looks exactly the same. He turned around and the beam was gone. Torch coin on black water. He was lost. Panic arrived on cue. Boulders every direction. Because this is the geometry that kills in the shaft. The pencil of light is visible only from near it. Swim far enough down the slope and the room folds it away behind the haze. And a torch cannot ask a black stadium for directions. 46 meters deep. 130 bar. No line. No beam, no up that mattered. Watch the 2 ledgers now, because there were 2. Above, Mick at the beam's edge, torch circling, the signal for "come back to me," with a mate's shape nowhere in it. Below, Lachlan swimming his search squares the way the manual says, burning 10 bar a minute in cold half-panic. Every glow he chased kept being his own torch, bouncing back off the haze. Put yourself in that black room for 1 minute of it. Your bubble's the only sound with an address. Every boulder the twin of the last one. And somewhere above and behind you, a green-gold column standing in open water, patient as a lighthouse, visible from everywhere except where you are. At 100 bar, he dropped his weight on a boulder to mark it and swam his squares wider. At 70, he believed, for 30 seconds, that a pale smear to his left was the beam,
and spent 20 meters of swimming on his own reflection. At 50, he stopped swimming squares. Mick did the bravest arithmetic of his life at the 6-minute mark. Left the beam he was forbidden to leave, tied his reel to a boulder at its edge, and swam the line out into the dark, torch flashing the recall, a lighthouse going looking for its ship. The reel found him at what the gauges later fixed as minute 19. Lachlan's torch first, wedged beam up between boulders at 52 meters, and then Lachlan, 3 meters past it, still, his gauge at 0, and his hand open toward the light he had finally seen too late.
Mick brought him up the pencil of light with the last third of his own air, screaming bubbles at the manhole, and the paddock above filled with sirens that had 40 minutes of farm road to drive. Lachlan Brodie died under a sheep paddock, in a room lit by one beam of sun, 11 fin kicks from the only exit sign the room has ever had. He had followed one more look past the edge of the light, and the room had simply closed behind him like water behind a stone. The inquest ruled the death disorientation and air exhaustion beyond the daylight zone, and its verdict rewrote the permit for everyone who came after. No diver beyond the beam without a line to it, and a strobe hung in the shaft on every dive, a second sun that cannot be folded away. The manhole in the paddock wears a locked grate now, and the club that dives the shaft reads one margin note aloud at every briefing, photographed from a dead man's logbook. Went a bit further, worth it, and then the roll call answers it together, the way the room taught them to. The only cave that opens through a farm manhole still stands its pencil of light in the black stadium every clear morning, 40 meters tall and 1 hand wide. Stay where you can see it. In that room, the light is not the view, it is the whole way home. On October 3rd, 2026, Ewan McAllister stepped off a boat onto the cold basalt causeway of Staffa in Scotland and walked into Fingal's cave, the only cave that the Atlantic built entirely of organ pipes, black 6-sided columns rising from the sea like the inside of an instrument. He had 4 hours ashore with his assistant Rona, a camera bag, and a swell forecast that promised flat water until the evening ferry of weather arrived. Ewan was 38 years old, a landscape photographer who had logged 15 years shooting the wild coasts of the Hebrides, patient as stone. His one rule came from a drowned tripod. He wrote the tide times on the back of his left hand, every trip, in marker, because the sea, he liked to say, keeps its appointments even when you lose the diary. That morning the hand said low water at noon, and the plan said deep inside the cave by past, shooting the columns while the sea was at its politest. Here is what you need to understand about Fingal's. The cave is a blind hall 70 meters deep, and its floor is not rock but ocean, a lane of open Atlantic running all the way to the back wall. The walkway is a ledge of broken columns along one wall, wet, stepped, and narrow. In flat water it is a stroll. In swell, the lane becomes a piston, and the hall becomes the pipe it was named for. The first hour was the postcard, the two of them working deep along the ledge, tripods braced between columns, the water below green and glassy, the entrance behind them a tall, bright doorway of sky. Boots on wet basalt, shutter clicks echoing down the hall. 60 meters in, at the last wide stance before the back wall, Ewan set up the shot he had crossed an ocean of ferries for. At 12:30, that is when the hall changed its sound. A long, low breath from the entrance, and the green lane below the ledge rose a hand's width and did not fully fall, because a storm 800 kilometers out had sent its swell ahead of schedule, and the flat water forecast had already failed. The doorway of sky behind them whitened at its base, and the first real set broke across the causeway they had walked in on. What he didn't know, reading the back of his left hand, the tide was still 2 hours from high. Everything the swell was doing now, it would do higher. And that habit would now earn back its drowned tripod. The marker numbers on his skin were about to become the only schedule that mattered. A set thundered into the hall and the piston fired. Spray to the ceiling. The ledge went under. They were trapped. Panic sang in the pipes. Because this is the trap Fingal sets. The exit ledge runs along the piston's barrel. 60 meters of wet, stepped basalt that every incoming set sweeps like a broom. And the only dry ground was the stance they stood on. 2 people, 1 camera bag, 2 hours of rising water, and a doorway of sky that now opened and shut with every set. Watch the ledger Ewan built on the back stance. The hand said, "High water at 2:30, the sea's appointment," written in marker. The boat due back at 4, with a skipper who counted heads like a shepherd. And between the stance and the daylight, 60 meters of swept ledge that would go quiet again the moment the tide turned and the swell lost its depth. He ran it like a man who photographs oceans for a living. Up 2 column steps to the highest dry stance, backs to the wall, tripod straps lashed to a basalt post, and the marker numbers doing their cold arithmetic out loud. Put yourself on that stance for 1 hour of it. The hull booming like the instrument it is, spray hissing off the columns after every set, the doorway of sky counting the waves for you, and a wet marker schedule on a cold left hand, promising, in your own handwriting, that this has an ending. At 1 hour, the water reached its appointment and stood at their boot soles on the high stance. At 2 hours, on schedule to the minute, it began to drop, and the sets, robbed of the tide's depth, started breaking outside the doorway instead of through it. They moved on the ebb the way the sea had taught them all afternoon, in the gaps between sets, ledge to ledge, counting 7 waves and running on the 8th, soaked to the ribs and precise as clockwork. Ewan came out of the doorway of sky last, camera bag held overhead, into the flat orange light of a sea that had already forgotten the whole performance, and the boat rounded the point 11 minutes later to a shepherd's count that came up even. The skipper looked at their soaked clothes, then at the glassy water, and Ewan held up the back of his left hand by way of explanation. The numbers still legible, the appointment kept by both parties. Both survived, and the incident report Ewan filed himself became a small legend of Hebridean seamanship. Swell arrived 110 minutes early. Party held the high stance for 2 hours, moved on the ebb, 0 injuries. The sea had failed to collect anything but a lens cap. The only sea cave built of organ pipes still plays every swell that finds it, and the tour boats still land on the causeway in fair weather. Ewan still writes the tide on the back of his left hand, every trip, and now Rona does too, their small marker ritual, twice per boat. The sea keeps its appointments, he tells the workshop students he brings to the doorway of sky. Write them down where you cannot lose them. And when the instrument starts playing early, climb, lash down, and let the tide finish its song, all 2 hours of it, without you in the barrel. On September 8, 2026, Petra Novak waded into the cool underground river of Son Doong in Vietnam, the only cave that owns a river, a jungle, and a sky. Passages so vast that clouds form under the ceiling, and forests grow where the roof has fallen in. Her survey team was 5 days into a 2-week expedition, and the day's job was the far bank. Cross at the wide, shallow braid, shoot the stations, and be back at camp for rice and fish by dark. Petra was 32 years old, an expedition surveyor who had logged 8 years in river caves on 3 continents, calm in water, careful out of it. Her team knew her for the whistle on her chest lanyard and one drilled rule. 3 short means stop, 3 long means find me, because a cave river, she liked to say, is a corridor that eats shouts. That morning the crossing was thigh-deep and friendly, and the far stations were 2 hours of easy work away. Here is what you need to understand about the river in Son Doong. It does not answer to the weather above the cave. It answers to the weather on the whole mountain. Rain that falls 2 valleys away arrives underground hours later as a flood pulse, a rise with a front edge, under a dry ceiling. The doctrine is short. The river owns the crossing. You rent it twice a day, and the rent goes up without notice. The day ran sweetly to the minute. Across the braid by headlamp and daylight shaft, the stations falling one by one, the tape hissing out over boulders while the river murmured its usual low argument with the stones. By mid-afternoon, the far bank's work was done. They came back to the braid in marching order, Petra last, the water still thigh-deep at the tail of the line. Mid-crossing, that is when the river's voice changed. A new note under the murmur, gravel beginning to knock and roll somewhere upstream in the dark, because a storm 2 valleys away had paid its rain into the mountain that morning, and the friendly crossing had already failed. The front edge of the pulse arrived as a brown stare of water, shin-high and businesslike, walking down the braid toward the line of headlamps. What she didn't know, waving the others ahead to the home bank, the stare was only the front edge, and that habit would now have to speak for her in the dark. The whistle on the chest lanyard, 3 short, 3 long, because the second stare took her legs out from under her mid-stride. The river folded her under and ran. Her lamp became a brown smear. Panic swam alongside her. She was swept. The team's lights vanished. Because this is what a pulse does in a giant cave. It does not drown the passage. It simply turns the floor into a conveyor, chest deep, fast and dark, with boulders for furniture and 800 meters of corridor before the next bend that owed anyone a favor. 1 woman in the water. 5 headlamps on the bank, facing the wrong way, and a river that had already changed its mind about the rent. Watch the 2 drills fire at once. On the bank, the team leader's count came up 1 short, and the line turned downstream at a run, lamps sweeping the water in overlapping arcs. In the water, feet downstream, arms wide, riding the tongue of the current the way river cavers are drilled to. Steering, not fighting, spending strength only at the margins where the water slowed. Put yourself in that ride for 1 minute of it. The roar total, the dark total. Your lamp a brown lantern in front of your own face. Boulders arriving out of nowhere like parked cars. And your whole plan reduced to 2 words from a drill: feet first. At 200 meters, she took a boulder on the shoulder and spun, and got her feet back downstream before the next one. At 500 meters, the corridor widened and the conveyor slowed to a walk. At 800 meters, her boots found gravel that held. A long, pale sandbank standing out of the flood at the foot of a daylight shaft. She crawled up it beyond the waterline, checked her limbs like a surveyor checks instruments, and then did the thing her team had groaned about for 8 years. 3 long blasts on the chest whistle. Rest 10 breaths. 3 long again. The sound ran the corridor the way water never lets a voice run it. Thin, high, and unmistakable over the flood's roar. The sweep line heard the 3rd set at the 40-minute mark and answered with 3 short, "Stop, we hear you," and came down the high boulder margin with rope and a spare lamp, following the whistle like a thread through the dark. They reached the Sandbank at hour 1 and found their surveyor sitting above the waterline, bruised, soaked, and annoyed about exactly one thing. The survey tape, still clipped to her harness, had 600 meters of the river's own measurements on it, and every one of them had held. She survived on a drill and a whistle, and the expedition report ruled the ride a textbook swept caver response and printed the numbers that made it 1. 800 meters carried, feet first the whole way, 1 shoulder bruise, and a signal heard at 40 minutes that a shout could never have made. The only cave that owns a river, a jungle, and a sky still takes its rain from 2 valleys away, and the crossing still rent by the hour. Petra still wears the whistle on the chest lanyard, and now so does every member of every team she trains. 3 short means stop, 3 long means find me. The river is a corridor where nobody can hear you shout, she tells them at the braid. So do not shout. Ride it feet first. Find the bank the river gives you, and let the whistle do the shouting. It has failed no one yet.